So friends, today is the last of 3 Sundays that we've been spending in the first chapter of the Gospel of Mark. Next Sunday, we'll turn our attention to the 9th chapter of Mark's Gospel, which chronicles the Transfiguration, our annual stop on the Sunday immediately before Ash Wednesday. But for today, we remain in the first chapter of Mark. So let us listen again for what God is saying to God's church. As soon as they left the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told him about her at once. Jesus came and took her by the hand and lifted her up. And then the fever left her, and she began to serve them. That evening, at sunset, they brought to him all who were sick or possessed with demons, and the whole city was gathered around the door. And he cured many who were sick with various diseases, and cast out many demons. He would not permit the demons to speak, because they knew him. In the morning, while it was still very dark, Jesus got up and went out to a deserted place, and there he prayed. And Simon and his companions hunted for him. When they found him, they said to him, "Everyone is searching for you." Jesus answered, "Let us go on to the neighboring towns, so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came out to do." And he went throughout Galilee, proclaiming the message in their synagogues and casting out demons. Friends, holy wisdom, holy word. Thanks be to God. Let's pray. O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable and pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. So last week we watched Jesus as he cast out a demon on the Sabbath in the synagogue in Capernaum. Today's passage moves the setting from the synagogue to the house of Simon Peter's mother-in-law, presumably that very same day. This passage is unique in that it is one of very few texts in the Gospels that refers to the disciples' families. We do not know the name of Simon Peter's mother-in-law, but we know that she had a fever, one that was life-threatening. Now, unlike the man with the unclean spirit in yesterday's passage, or last week's passage, Jesus doesn't heal her with just a word. Instead, his healing contains a physical element. He came, he took her by the hand, and lifted her up. Interestingly, that verb for lift is the same verb used elsewhere in the gospel to refer to Jesus' resurrection. So once Simon Peter's mother-in-law was lifted or resurrected by Jesus, the fever left her and she began to serve them. Now this particular verb, serve, deserves some unpacking. Centuries of patriarchal interpretation of today's passage have taught many of us to assume that she got up and cooked them breakfast. But such interpretations fail to recognize the complexity and the nuance of the verb here. The verb here to describe what she did is the Greek word diakoneo. Diakoneo. If that word sounds a little bit familiar to you, it's because it's the same word that we use to get the word deacon. Therefore, in a sense, Simon Peter's mother-in-law was the first ever deacon in the history of the church. Now, while diakoneo can mean to serve in the sense of food, of waiting for someone at a table, it also means to serve in the more general sense, as in to care for, to take care of, to help, support, or minister to and with. Now, I learned this week that archaeologists have found the remains of a house in Capernaum on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, that appears to have been a home residence that had at some point been converted into a meeting or worship space around the time of today's passage in the Gospel of Mark. Today, that location is considered by many to be the site of today's passage. In fact, there is now a monastery on top of it, a church. Now, if this is true and the house was later converted into a meeting place, it would definitely suggest that Simon Peter's mother-in-law did far more than cook Jesus and the disciples a meal following her miraculous healing. And there is good reason to suggest that this was the home that's referred to elsewhere in Mark's Gospel that Jesus and his disciples returned to periodically to be rejuvenated, refreshed, and ministered to as they continued their work. And so Simon Peter's mother-in-law might have been what you and I in the Presbyterian Church might consider the first ever teaching or ruling elder in the early church. As the panelists on this week's podcast episode of Pulpit Fiction said, this is a great story to preach on the ministry of women. Women in the gospel tend to get it long before the men. Service is not the, quote, proper place of women. It is the proper place for all Christians. It's also worth noting that Jesus was technically breaking the law, breaking biblical law, by healing someone on the Sabbath. It didn't cause much of a stir because this particular miracle happened in the privacy of Simon Peter's mother-in-law's home. But this might also explain why the rest of the community waited until sundown to bring their sick friends and family members to that same house, gathering outside the front door, begging Jesus to heal them too. And heal them he did. The text suggests that Jesus spent the entire night healing the long line of people begging for his help. And he got so overwhelmed and exhausted that he retreated to a private place early in the morning before the sun even rose in order to catch his breath. This is one of several places in the Gospels where we see Jesus prioritizing his self-care in the form of quiet prayer, of time spent alone with God to remain focused on what God is calling him to do. But Jesus' own personal Sabbath is quickly brought to an end when disciples hunt him down. It's a very interesting verb there. Hunt him down and inform Jesus that everyone is looking for him. It would seem that the line is still growing, and many more are waiting to be healed by Jesus. But then Jesus does a very peculiar thing when he's informed of this. He says, okay, it's time to go, and go on to the next place. And that's exactly what he does. Verse 38 says, he answered, let us go on to the neighboring town so that I may proclaim the message there also, for that is what I came to do. This pisses me off. This pisses me off because as I was working on this sermon, I kept on getting bothered by this part of the story, and I actually found myself getting angry at Jesus because we all know what it feels like to be at the back of the line. We all know what it feels like to wait for healing and to wait and wait on it some more. And I couldn't help but think about all the people waiting to be healed back at the home of Simon Peter's mother-in-law. You know, if I were one of them, I can't say I'd have anything particularly polite or gracious to say or think if I was told, too bad, Jesus has moved on, you're on your own. We all know how much it sucks to be at the back of the line. And it sucks even more when the line gets cut off right in front of you. Think of that time in the grocery store when you've waited and waited in line just to have the cashier go on break and close the register right before you get there. Or think of the times that being in the back of the line was more than just an inconvenience. Think of that time that you were waiting for that job, that child, that organ transplant, that open bed at the rehab facility, or that MRI that finally shows signs of remission. Or to use the almost universal example these days, many of us are waiting to get our COVID-19 vaccinations. As of today, only 9.1% of folks in this country have received their first dose, and only 2.5% are fully vaccinated. So we still have a long way to go, and for many of us, we'll be waiting for some time. There are so many things that we wait for, things that bring about renewal, restoration, healing, relief. But sometimes we find ourselves at the back of the line. Sometimes we feel like those folks back at Simon Peter's mother-in-law's house, hearing with anger, frustration, and sadness that healing is going to have to wait another day because the healer has moved on to the next town. So today's text perhaps offers us a space to hold our collective grief as all of us endure this extended period of waiting. But there also might be another angle, equally true angle to today's text, one that might give hope to those that find themselves at the end of the line. As I was seething in my anger and frustration with this text this week, as I was preparing for the sermon, a colleague of mine reminded me that I was forgetting about someone in my anger. I was forgetting about Simon Peter's mother-in-law. Because if we are to take that verb, diakoneo, to serve seriously, and if we understand the full length and breadth of what that kind of service means, then today's text does not leave the folks at the back of the line without the support that they were begging for. It just means they might not get it from Jesus. They might get it from Simon Peter's mother-in-law. You know, in college and seminary, when I first started really my in-depth studies of the Gospels, I often resented Mark's Gospel for its brevity. Matthew, Luke, and John are just so much more detailed compared to Mark. Mark is quick, to the point, and quickly moves on from story to story. But over the years of preaching on Mark, I've actually come to appreciate its brevity and relative lack of detail because it gives my imagination room to stretch its wings and to complete the story that might feel like it was so quickly cut off. So maybe let our imaginations do some work with today's text. You know, I believe a faithful reading of today's story can lead us to imagine the ending to this story that Mark's gospel never gave us. Imagine, if you will, Simon Peter's mother-in-law rolling up her sleeves and getting to work feeding, healing, teaching, supporting, lifting up, resurrecting the people Jesus left behind when he moved on to preach his message elsewhere. What if this whole time it was never Jesus' intention to heal everyone himself? What if all along his movement was to heal some folks in order to empower and enable them to go do likewise? So in some sense, whenever we come to this table, as we will in a few minutes, the Lord's table, we are reminded in ways both large and small that we have been healed by Jesus. We've been healed by his words and teachings. We've been healed time and time again by his forgiveness. We've been healed by his touch. We've been healed by his relentless presence with us through thick and thin. And this table, whether it is here in this worship space or your table at your house, is a place where we come to be reminded of these truths and to be held in their comforting embrace. But we do not stay at the table forever. We do not stay at the table any longer than Jesus stayed in Capernaum in today's passage. We leave the table and we follow Jesus elsewhere, continuing the work that we're called to do in his name. So let us follow the example of Simon Peter's mother-in-law, who in some ways understood Jesus and his mission well before any of the other disciples did. So having been lifted up by Jesus or by the hands of one of his followers, let us join in the work of lifting up and serving others. In the name of God, the Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer, may all of us, God's beloved children, say, Amen.